The message arrived at 2:47 in the morning, not through diplomatic channels, not through any official line. It came through a back route, the kind used when someone wants to deliver a threat, while still maintaining the appearance of respectability. The sender was General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, son of Uganda's long-serving president, commander of the Uganda People's Defense Force, and a man whose name carried weight across East Africa. The message was short, blunt, almost contemptuous in its brevity. It said, "Choose your side before it is chosen for you. The world is watching Burkina Faso, and so are we." Ibrahim Traoré read it once, set it down, and said nothing. Yeah, that silence, that particular silence, was the moment everything changed, because General Muhoozi had made an assumption, the same assumption that powerful men always make about leaders from smaller nations, from poorer nations, from nations that have spent decades being told what to do by larger ones. He assumed that the message would land like a stone in still water, that it would ripple outward into panic, into scrambling, into a young leader desperately trying to figure out how to appease the right people. He assumed that Ibrahim Traoré would do what so many had done before him: bend, negotiate his principles downward, find a comfortable position between dignity and submission, and call it diplomacy. He assumed wrong. The context that had triggered this confrontation was already burning across international headlines. Israel and Iran had entered a direct exchange of fire. Not proxy conflict, not shadow warfare, but open, declared hostility between two nations with the capacity to drag the entire world into their gravitational pull. Every government on Earth was being quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, pressured to signal alignment. The Western Bloc wanted a unified front behind Israel. Iran's partners across the global South were being courted, warned, and in some cases threatened into solidarity. And somewhere in the middle, small nations, nations that had nothing to do with the origins of this conflict, nations that shared no border with the Middle East, nations whose people were dying from jihadist violence and economic strangulation were being told to pick a side. Muhoozi had already picked his, publicly, loudly, with the unmistakable eagerness of a man who understands that performance is currency in the global attention economy. He had posted statements of support for Israel, framed the conflict in civilizational terms, and positioned himself as a voice of African pragmatism, a leader wise enough to align with Western power structures rather than resist them. And then, perhaps emboldened by his own performance, he had reached sideways toward Ouagadougou with that 2:47 a.m. message, a nudge, a test, a quiet invitation to fall in line. What Muhoozi did not understand, what so many powerful men had failed to understand before encountering Ibrahim Traoré, was that the young president of Burkina Faso had already seen this trap from 3 miles away. He had seen it when the first diplomatic whispers began circulating. Yet he had seen it when certain embassies in Ouagadougou began scheduling unusual meetings. He had seen it in the pattern, the old, familiar pattern, of external actors engineering a moment of crisis, then presenting themselves as the only solution to the crisis they created. Traoré's inner circle convened at dawn. The meeting was not large. It never was. He ran a tight room. People who understood that their function was honest analysis, not flattery. His foreign affairs advisor, a woman named Fatou, who had spent 15 years working in international law before returning to Burkina Faso, spread 3 documents across the table: intercepted communications, a leaked briefing from a regional security summit that Traoré had not attended, and a financial thread, subtle, traceable only if you knew what you were looking for, connecting certain advocacy organizations that had begun amplifying pressure on Ouagadougou to align with Uganda's public position. Fatou said, "They are not asking you to take a position on Israel and Iran. They are asking you to demonstrate that Burkina Faso can be moved. That is the test." Traore looked at the financial thread for a long moment. Then he said, "Then we will demonstrate something else entirely." The strategy that emerged from that meeting was not reactive. It was not defensive. It was the kind of move that only becomes visible in hindsight, when people look back and try to understand how a young leader under extraordinary pressure managed to transform a trap into a platform. Traore would not issue a statement about Israel. He would not issue a statement about Iran. He would not acknowledge Muhuzi's message directly or indirectly. Instead, he would do something that made all of that noise irrelevant. He would make Burkina Faso's position so clear, so principled, and so visibly rooted in the interests of his own people that any outside attempt to characterize or pressure that position would look exactly like what it was: interference. But before that strategy could unfold, the situation got worse. It got significantly worse. A leaked recording surfaced, or appeared to surface, showing what sounded like a conversation between a senior Burkinabe official and a representative connected to Iranian diplomatic channels. The recording was brief, grainy, contextless, in the way that damaging recordings always are. But it was already circulating through West African media networks by mid-morning, and the framing was immediate and vicious. Burkina Faso secretly aligning with Iran against Israel. Traore betraying Africa's security partnerships. Within hours, 3 things happened simultaneously. A Western ambassador requested an urgent meeting with Ouagadougou's foreign ministry. A regional bloc issued a carefully worded statement calling for all member states to maintain transparency in their geopolitical alignments. And General Muhuzi posted on social media, his preferred battlefield, with barely concealed triumph. Actions speak louder than silence. True African leaders know which side of history to stand on. The trap had upgraded itself. What began as pressure had become a narrative, and narratives, once they achieve velocity, are almost impossible to stop from the outside. Almost. Traore called Fatou back in. He also called his intelligence chief, a quiet man named Colonel Ouagadougou, who had served under 3 previous governments and survived all of them by being extraordinarily careful about what he said and to whom. Ouagadougou placed a second file on the table. He had been working through the night. The recording was fabricated, not altered, fabricated. The voice patterns were assembled from existing audio, the kind of deep synthesis that had become disturbingly accessible to well-resourced actors over the past 2 years. The Burkinabe official whose voice had allegedly been captured had been in a military hospital receiving treatment for a shoulder injury at the time the supposed conversation took place. There were medical records. Yet there were security logs. There were timestamps that made the fabrication not just provable, but embarrassingly provable. The kind of embarrassing that only happens when someone moves too fast and assumes their target will be too panicked to investigate properly. Traore sat with this information for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he said, "Good. We let it run for another 6 hours." Fatou looked up. Ouagadougou said nothing, which was how he expressed his complete understanding. Traore explained right. Not at length, because he never explained at length when precision was available. If we respond now, we contain the damage, but we lose the opportunity. If we wait, they will commit further. They will build more on top of the fabrication. They will invest more people, more credibility, give more public statements into a structure that we can then demolish completely. We let them build. Then we remove the foundation. It was the kind of thinking that makes enemies underestimate you, right up until the moment they cannot afford to anymore. The 6 hours passed. Muhuzi posted twice more, each post slightly more specific, slightly more invested in the narrative of Traore as a compromised actor playing dangerous geopolitical games at his people's expense. The regional bloc's statement was amplified by 3 international media organizations. 2 other African heads of state, clearly operating from shared talking points, issued comments suggesting that small nations cannot afford the luxury of ambiguity in times of global crisis. And then Ouagadougou released its file. Not a statement, a file, a full, documented, the time-stamped, technically annotated intelligence report demonstrating the fabrication of the recording, including the tools used, the metadata trails, and the distribution network through which the fake audio had entered circulation. Alongside this, released simultaneously, were the financial threads Fatu had identified, now more fully traced, connecting the pressure campaign against Burkina Faso to organizations with documented ties to political actors in Uganda and to a Western lobbying firm that had been hired specifically to manage African narrative alignment in the context of the Israel-Iran conflict. The term paid puppet, which had been used against Traore in anonymous social media attacks over the previous 48 hours, appeared in those lobbying firm documents. It was one of their recommended phrases, a tested message. In pre-approved language designed to discredit leaders who refused to perform alignment on command. The reversal was total. Within 20 minutes of the file's release, the 3 international media organizations that had amplified the fabricated recording had issued corrections. Within an hour, the regional bloc's secretariat released a statement calling for a review of the information it had been given before issuing its earlier comment. Within 2 hours, the Western ambassador who had requested an urgent meeting with Burkina Faso's foreign ministry sent word that the meeting was no longer necessary. General Muhuzi deleted his posts. Not all of them. That would have been too obvious, just the most specific ones. But deletion on social media is its own kind of confession, and people noticed, and the noticers were loud. Well, what happened next is what separated this moment from dozens of similar moments in African political history, where a leader who successfully defends himself then uses that success to settle scores, consolidate personal power, or simply bask in the validation of being right. Traore did none of these things. He called a press conference in French with interpreters available, broadcast openly, and he spoke for 11 minutes. He did not mention Muhuzi by name. He did not mention Uganda. He did not characterize the Western lobbying firm or the media organizations. He spoke about Burkina Faso. He spoke about the approximately 46% of his country's territory that remained under threat from jihadist insurgency. He spoke about the villages that had been evacuated, the schools that had been burned, the families who had been displaced, not because of anything happening in the Middle East, but because of a crisis that the international community had spent years either ignoring or making worse through interventions that served outside interests rather than Burkinabe lives. He said, "When the world asks us to take sides in a conflict that is not ours, it is asking us to spend the political capital we need for our own survival on someone else's priorities. We will not do this, not because we are enemies of anyone, but because we are the servants of our own people first, and that is not a negotiable position." He said, "The recording that was circulated against us was a lie. We have proven this. We do not ask for an apology. We ask only that those who were misled by it now look more carefully at who benefits from Burkina Faso appearing weak, confused, or compromised. The answer to that question will tell you something important about the nature of the pressure we face every day." He said, "We are not choosing sides between Israel and Iran. We are choosing the side of Burkina Faso. We will continue to choose that side every time we are asked. regardless of who is doing the asking. 11 minutes. No notes, no teleprompter. The clip circulated faster than anything that had been used against him. It was subtitled in Arabic, in English, in Portuguese, in Swahili. It was shared by journalists who had been skeptical of Traore, by analysts who had questioned his leadership, and by ordinary people across the continent who recognized in those 11 minutes something they had spent years waiting to hear. A leader who had been attacked, who had the evidence to be vicious, and who chose instead to simply be right. The international response split along predictable lines, but the split was more interesting than it appeared. Within the African Union, there was a quiet reckoning, not public because these things never happen publicly, but real. The bloc's earlier statement, now embarrassed by its own retraction, prompted an internal review of how regional bodies respond to narrative pressure campaigns. 3 member states that had been preparing to add their voices to the chorus against Traore quietly withdrew from that process. 2 of them sent private communications to Ouagadougou, not apologies exactly, but the diplomatic equivalent, expressions of continued partnership and interest in bilateral discussions. Muhoozi eventually resurfaced with a general post about African unity that mentioned no specifics and committed to nothing. It was the kind of statement that is designed to look like moving forward while actually just moving away from a disaster. The people who understood what had happened read it correctly. The people who hadn't been following closely accepted it as statesmanship. Either way, it was the end of his attempt to define Traore's position for him. The lobbying firm became a story in its own right. Several investigative journalists, now in possession of Burkina Faso's released documentation, began tracing the firm's other operations across the continent. What they found suggested that the Burkina Faso operation was not unique. It was a template being applied in multiple countries where leaders had shown resistance to alignment requests from Western-backed geopolitical projects. The story grew beyond Traore, beyond Muhoozi, beyond the Israel-Iran backdrop that had triggered the entire sequence. It became a story about the infrastructure of influence, the organized, funded, systematic machinery for making African governments perform compliance on cue. Traore had not just survived a pressure campaign. He had, by surviving it with documentation rather than denial, given everyone watching the tools to understand how such campaigns functioned. That was the part that couldn't be undone. That was the part that made this different. Back in Ouagadougou, yet the practical work continued without pause because the most important thing Traore had understood from the beginning, the thing that had kept him steady through the 2:47 a.m. message, through the fabricated recording, through the amplified narrative, through the coordinated pressure, was that the goal of all of it was not actually to change his position on Israel and Iran. Nobody genuinely believed that Burkina Faso's alignment would alter the trajectory of that conflict by 1 degree. The goal was distraction. The goal was to consume his government's time, energy, political capital, and public credibility in a fight that had nothing to do with Burkina Faso's actual challenges. Every hour his team spent responding to fabricated recordings was an hour not spent on counterterrorism strategy. Every political relationship strained by regional bloc pressure was a relationship that couldn't be used for economic partnership. The attack was not on his position. The attack was on his bandwidth. And so the deepest part of his victory was not the press conference, powerful as it was. The deepest part was that he had run the entire response: documentation, strategic delay, release, public statement, in parallel with the normal operations of governance. Ouagadougou's intelligence work had happened alongside, not instead of, ongoing security coordination with allied forces in the Sahel. Fatou's foreign affairs work had continued across 3 other active diplomatic tracks while she managed the crisis. Traoré himself had held 2 scheduled meetings on agricultural infrastructure during the same period that Muhoozi was posting his most aggressive social media content. He had refused to let them make him a crisis, even when they manufactured one. The final piece came 10 days later. Quiet, undramatic, the kind of ending that doesn't look like an ending until you zoom out. A delegation from the regional bloc's secretariat visited Ouagadougou, not to investigate, not to pressure, but to listen. They sat with Fatou for 3 hours. They asked questions about Burkina Faso's security situation, its economic constraints, its counter-terrorism partnerships, its genuine geopolitical priorities. They asked, in other words, the questions they should have been asking before they issued a statement. Before they allowed themselves to be used as amplifiers for a fabricated crisis, Fatou answered all of it, calmly, thoroughly, without resentment. Because Traore had been clear. The goal was not to make enemies of institutions that could still be useful partners. The goal was to make those institutions better by demonstrating what it looked like when a nation refused to be a variable in someone else's equation. At the end of the meeting, the lead delegate said something that was not recorded and not released. But Fatou mentioned it to Traore afterward, and he smiled. The particular smile of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and has just been told it arrived. The delegate had said, "We underestimated the depth of the analysis coming out of Ouagadougou. We will not make that mistake again." Traore had said nothing in response when Fatou told him. He didn't need to. Being underestimated had been, from the beginning, part of the architecture of his strategy. The people who thought he was small enough to push had pushed. The people who thought he was young enough to frighten had delivered their 2:47 a.m. messages. The people who thought he was isolated enough to fabricate against without consequence had fabricated, and each of them, in trying to reduce him, had revealed themselves, their methods, their funders, their networks, their assumptions, to a watching continent that was learning, slowly and then all at once, how to read the machinery behind the curtain. He stood where he had always stood, in Burkina Faso, accountable to Burkina Faso, unmoved by the pressure of people who had confused loudness for power and money for legitimacy. The jihadist insurgency in the East still required attention. The economic reconstruction still required discipline. The diplomatic realignment that served his people's actual interests rather than inherited patterns was still ongoing, careful, strategic work. None of that had changed. None of it had been derailed. And the men who had tried to derail it, the ones who sent middle-of-the-night messages, who posted triumphant social media content, who funded lobbying firms with pre-tested insult language, had learned something that powerful men always find hardest to accept, that a leader who knows exactly who he is cannot be told who he is, that a man who has chosen his people completely, without reservation or private negotiation, he cannot be bought because there is nothing in him that is for sale, that the word puppet says everything about the person wielding it and nothing, absolutely nothing, about Ibrahim Traoré.